There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott, and joining me for an examination and conversation on tonight's podcast, it's the solo debut of longtime STVD co-host, Jamie Jo Kelly. Hello, Jamie, and welcome aboard.
Hey, Scott. I am happy to be here to talk about these two episodes.
I'm glad to have you. I know you've been waiting in the wings since February, so I'm glad we could get you on board tonight for the episodes we'll be looking at, which will be the 17th and 18th episodes from season 1, which are The Fever and The Last Flight. I do want to mention, however, I was going over my notes for the entire season so far, and I've actually decided to revise my grades for 2 episodes. In both cases, the grades are being lowered. I will get to that when I'm grading the first episode tonight, which is The Fever. So let's get started with that episode. Now, The Fever was directed by Robert Florey. Now, I dug into the history of Mr. Florey on STVD episode 433 because he was the director of Perchance to Dream, and one can go back there to find out more about him because he had quite a colorful and fascinating Hollywood history. So if you missed that podcast, it's definitely worth checking out, much as they all are. He won't come up again for quite some time on this podcast because he does have one more Twilight Zone episode under his belt, but it's the episode The Long Morrow, which aired midway through the 5th season. So it's probably going to be a couple of years before we get there. The episode was, of course, written by Mr. Serling. So let's just get to the cast. In the lead role as Franklin Gibbs, we have Everett Sloane. Everett Sloane was born in New York City back in 1909. He initially fell in love with acting at the obscenely young age of 7, when he actually played Puck in a school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. But over a decade later, he found he was perhaps a little too thin-skinned for the profession, as he'd become overly distraught over poor reviews of his stage performances. He then left acting for a job on Wall Street in 1928, and well, a year later, when the market crashed and his salary was cut in half, he began to do voice acting on various projects ranging from detective melodramas to even being the voice of Adolf Hitler on the March of Time radio serials. It was that work that led to his meeting Orson Welles, who was a fellow March of Time's performer, and he was later hired by Welles to join his Mercury Theater Players. Now, once again, we have the iconic masterpiece Citizen Kane being referenced on this Twilight Zone podcast, but now it's for a more direct connection, because Everett Sloane was actually cast as Mr. Bernstein. By the way, it's not lost on me and fellow cinephiles that a major part of Citizen Kane coincidentally deals with how poorly someone deals with receiving bad reviews, much the way Everett Sloane did earlier in his life. Sloane would star in another key role for Welles as the insidious lawyer Bannister in Orson Welles' The Lady from Shanghai. Now, Sloane would go on to appear in several other feature films as well as choice TV roles, ranging from portraying Vincent van Gogh to years later going back to his voice acting roots, as he was cast as the voice of Dick Tracy in over 130 cartoons, as well as voicing several characters on Jonny Quest. One more really quirky claim to fame for Mr. Sloane: he actually wrote the lyrics for the vocal version of Fishin' Hole, the iconically whistled theme to The Andy Griffith Show. Believe it or not, I actually know that song, as I'm someone who never watched an entire episode of the series, but I had a TV top hit CD many years ago, and a version that was sung by Andy Griffith was on that CD, and it quickly became one of my favorite tunes on the CD. You know, kind of went, well, I'll take down your fishing pole and meet me at the fishing hole. You get the idea. I'm going to stop there, especially as my look at Mr. Sloane's life is about to veer from a song so idyllic to an end so horribly tragic. But before we get there, I will mention how he got connected to this episode of Twilight Zone. Sloane was actually cast as a second lead in the film and stage versions of the production called Patterns in the mid-50s. And the man who wrote that screenplay, was Mr. Rod Serling. But as I mentioned, horribly tragic. That's because we sadly have another performer from a Twilight Zone episode who would go on to take their own life. Not as remotely old as one might have guessed. At the age of 55, Sloan feared he was going blind due to glaucoma, and as a result, he took an overdose of barbiturates and passed away. Next, we have Vivi Janice, who plays Flora Gibbs. I probably mispronounced her name just now. Her screen work came a little later in life than it did for most actresses, as her career didn't really kick into gear beyond stage work until her late 30s, early 40s. Outside of the fun monster movie The Phantom from 10,000 Leagues, not to be confused with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, of course, and two other even smaller roles, she remained a TV actress, appearing on shows ranging from Alfred Hitchcock in the 1950s all the way to both The Rockford Files and the little-remembered spin-off of The Rockford Files, Richie Brockelman, Private Eye, in the late 1970s. But something more notable about her were her two marriages. She was married to Robert Cummings from 1935 to the fall of 1943, which was a year after Cummings had starred in major films like King's Row and Hitchcock's Saboteur. And then she later married John Larch in 1955, and they remained together until her passing in 1983. Why am I mentioning this? Well, you may recall that name, John Larch, because he was also discussed in STVD episode 433, because he played the psychiatrist on Perchance to Dream. And as I said, then he would go on to appear in two more Twilight Zone episodes, including the incredibly iconic It's a Good Life. Janice herself does appear in one more Twilight Zone episode, the darkly fun genie episode from season 2, The Man in the Bottle. Other than those two, I will quickly run down a couple others. William, or Bill Kensey, who plays the casino hotel representative, does appear in another Twilight Zone episode, one that people likely remember once they hear the title, Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up, from season 2. Anyone else here of note? Well, the fellow who plays the drunk guy at the casino, Art Lewis, he actually has an uncredited part in the following season's A Most Unusual Camera. But at this point, I feel that's enough for me. Let me turn the controls over to my most patient co-pilot here, Jamie, so she can walk us through the story of The Fever.
Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Gibbs, 3 days and 2 nights, all expenses paid, at a Las Vegas hotel, won by virtue of Mrs. Gibbs' knack of a phrase. But unbeknownst to either Mr. or Mrs. Gibbs is the fact that there's a prize in their package neither expected nor bargained for. In just a moment, one of them will succumb to an illness worse than any virus can produce, a most inoperative, deadly, life-shattering affliction known as a fever. The bright lights of Vegas and an upbeat tempo set the scene as Mr. and Mrs. Gibbs enter the hotel casino floor. They meet hotel manager Henson and photographer Joe, who welcome them as big winners worthy of a photograph. Mrs. Gibbs seems giddy with excitement, in stark contrast to Mr. Gibbs, who appears to be skeptical of the celebratory photo op and raises an eyebrow at the idea of a photograph appearing in the Elgin Bugle newspaper back home. Flora and Franklin Gibbs take in the activity of the casino. Cheers, jeers, bells, and whistles. Flora's eyes glitter enthusiastically. Franklin, who is not willing to dip his toe into the immoral misery of gambling, reminds Flora that they are only there to let Flora experience the vacation she's won, even if it is a terrible waste of time. At the back wall of the casino, a roll atop flashes special jackpot as the machine pays out to a very animated winner. Flora decides one nickel couldn't hurt and places the nickel into the slot. Franklin declares Flora immature, irresponsible. But Franklin, the nickel is already in the machine. Flora won't have the luck that she hopes for, not from this machine and not from her vacation. Franklin, feeling as if his point was made, heads to his room, but is quickly stopped by a four-eyed pinstripe drunk who insists Franklin take the dollar from his hand and places it into the nearest machine. As Flora approaches, Franklin pulls the lever. The roll-a-top hits hot, and plums pay out. Flora is overjoyed, but Franklin boasts of responsibility, stating that the Gibbs know the value of money, and it's best to quit while ahead. They leave the floor, but Franklin hears his machine ring out as the drunk returns to play. As the Gibbs lay in bed, Franklin hears a disembodied voice call out his name. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. With each call, the stack of silver on Franklin's nightstand grows. In the background, an upright bass plays a jazzy scale, daring Franklin to cross his moral boundary. He decides it's best to get rid of the tainted money by putting it back in the machine. Sometime later, we find Franklin in front of that machine. It's clear that Franklin has not been lucky as he cashes a third check, desperate to win back his loss. He very loudly blames Flora for being a shrew. She tries to quiet him as he blames his poor luck on her. Onlookers circle around, witnessing the scene that Franklin is creating. Franklin sees the devil in the game. He declares that the roll-a-top lets you win a little and then takes it all back. It teases you before he feverishly turns to pull at the machine again. Cashier and floor manager comment, once they get hooked, they really get hooked. The jazzy beats that were once so optimistic drag their tempo down and repeat the same scale with every pull of the slot. 24 hours later, and Franklin is in need of a shave and sleep and is still sliding further into his fever. He spins again and again until the machine locks. Unable to pull the lever, Franklin becomes enraged and shoves the machine over, trying to hit it and strangle it as the security hauls him from the floor and out the door. An out-of-order sign is placed on the roll-a-top. Franklin is stewing in his hotel room. He insists to Flora that the machine broke down deliberately, a thief stealing his very last silver. From outside the door, a familiar voice calls to Franklin. It's the roll-a-top. It's come for him. It's chasing him. Flora tries to break through Franklin's panic, telling him there is nothing there, but it's too late. The machine pushes through the door and drives Franklin closer and closer to the window until he breaks through the glass and plummets to his death. The officials looking over Franklin's broken body comment that they've never seen someone as hooked as he. Off screen, we hear the sound of a slot being pulled with a single coin payout. A coin rolls on screen and into the hand of Franklin's corpse. There stands the roll top, as if to say, "Here's your dollar, chump." It flashes, blinks, and clinks, another victim, fallen from fever. Mr. Franklin Gibbs, visitor to Las Vegas, who lost his money, his reason, and finally his life, all to an inanimate metal machine, variously described as a one-armed bandit, a slot machine, or, in Mr. Franklin Gibbs' words, a monster with a will all its own. For our purposes, we'll stick with the later definition because we're in the Twilight Zone. This episode was written by Sterling, and it was inspired by his own experiences in Las Vegas. He was celebrating the official signing of the Twilight Zone, and while his wife Carol had all the luck, he had none, and it drove him mad. I kind of think that Franklin's dialogue was the best part of this entire episode. It was an excellent declaration of addiction itself. In gambling or substance abuse, etc., addiction is a monster without conscience, and it leaves you chasing that first payout and losing everything in the process. And no matter how pious or well-bred someone may believe themselves to be, they are not impervious to its clutches. Which leads me to the satisfaction of the story. To see a very unlikable man expose his fault from behind the hypocrisy that he lurks in is maybe a bit pleasing. And my final thoughts are a sadness for sweet Flora. She may now be free from a mean little man, but he's left her broke. All in all, this episode is definitely silly by today's standards, but it still gives you what you want from the Twilight Zone, which is a story with a moral and the exposure of man's true nature. Handing it over to you, Scott.
I look at it as this is one of those almost too simple episodes. I mean, the premise is set up almost immediately, and the main character succumbs to the addiction here of gambling and the insanity fairly quickly. And we just wait to see how it will ultimately and most certainly tragically will turn out. And I don't mean that as a negative thing. I'm just pointing out again, it's a phrase that's used, especially on this podcast quite often. It's the sheer economy of storytelling and how we get to the point really quick. Everything happens at a fairly accelerated pace in this episode. Now, it's funny, when we focus on the Franklin character, and this kind of goes over some territory you just mentioned, but I find it interesting that the way I look at Franklin is that he may not be a fun guy, but he's not a bad guy per se. He's certainly uptight. He's a stiff. He's a prig, perhaps. Well, he's all those things, but I wouldn't necessarily call him a bad guy. But this is another one of those episodes where I really fail to understand how this couple ever happened. It's much like an episode from earlier in the season that the podcast has covered, Escape Clause. That's the one with David Wayne selling his soul for immortality. It's almost impossible to imagine a time where these men would have been remotely kind and loving to their presumably long-suffering wives. And it was certainly the case with this episode. Now, I would say there were only two things maybe about the episode which kind of bothered me when I saw it decades ago. And I don't know if my mind has changed that much over the years now that I've rewatched it just the other night. They're not major points. Number one, I never really liked the weird Franklin voice from the slot machine calling out to him. I get why it has to be there. But I'll tell you, I've given thought to whether there could have been just some sort of distinctive sound made by the machine whenever the lever was pulled, or when a jackpot was hit, or something that could have been used. But I guess the word Franklin is supposed to hit you in a creepy, hair-raising kind of a way. You know, maybe I'm a little more torn on that after all. Much like number two, how they alter the machine with that light that resembles, I guess, a mouth or a smile or something, which is not there when he's actually playing the machine. It's only when he believes the slot machine is actually stalking him in his room. I always found that kind of weird also. It's like, well, why is that there? It's not, I mean, thankfully they didn't have the budget to use any sort of animation at the time. That could have only made it worse. But overall, it's a good episode in the sense of how simple it is. There's not very much to it. You know what? I'm going to get to my roundup here, and that will be where I'll really get into how I view the episode overall, because I'll get to my grade. But I'm going to talk about the tone first. And well, I can't say this is one of the funny episodes, even if it is a bit outlandish. And we're certainly going to come across a few more like that. There's a certain level of suspense. It's serious. It's kind of tragic. I don't really know if there's anywhere else to go here as far as the tone is concerned. Now, tropes, on the other hand. You know what? At this point, I'm going to say the ill-matched couple thing I mentioned earlier, that's got to be a trope for the Twilight Zone, because I can already think about 3 or 4 more that are going to come our way. We've already seen a few already. So we'll toss that in the mix. Your setting of a hotel or a casino, gambling in general, that will come up a lot on the Twilight Zone. A machine that's seemingly alive. Yes, that is something else we'll certainly see on several Twilight Zone episodes. And not just death, but someone taking a big death plummet, falling from a window or off a ledge, a roof, a cliff, whatever. This happens a bunch of times on the Twilight Zone. It's already happened a couple of times in the 18 episodes we've covered. Someone's gone crashing out a window. You know, perchance the dream we mentioned earlier. Same thing happens to the main character in that episode. So we get to the ratings aspect. Rating the ending. Okay. The ending is okay. It's not particularly super satisfying or unexpected at all. I feel it's kind of standard, if anything. So at that point, I'm just going to give it a 6. As for the episode, you know what? I don't think I'm going to budge from that number. So I'm going to give the episode a 6 as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, while I'm in the frame of mind to be dispensing less than truly stellar grades for a Twilight Zone episode, let me now take the time to quickly revise and really correct my grades from 2 episodes previously discussed on previous podcasts. On STVD 434, I gave the episode What You Need an 8. I think I recall Joe might have had a problem with that. Not sure. But looking back, that grade, it makes no sense whatsoever. So it should be lowered to a 7. And also on the previous podcast, number 436, I believe I gave the episode The Hitchhiker an 8.5. No, that should be an 8. Shouldn't be any higher than that. That all said, let me shift back to what this podcast is supposed to be focusing on, which means I will now need to tinker a little bit with what Mr. Sterling's sneak peek preview of the next episode was when this aired back in January 29th, 1960. I believe he had a prop with him at the time, or should I say a propeller plane, I should say. Well, you'll see. This is the model of a Newport, a fighter aircraft, vintage World War I. Next on this podcast, it's flown on a patrol over France in 1917, and its pilot discovers that time has passed him by. Kenneth Hay stars in Richard Matheson's exciting story of The Last Flight on the Twilight Zone. And with that, let's open the book on The Last Flight. The episode was directed by William Claxton. Now, Claxton's career really started in the 1940s as a film editor. During the time he served in World War II, he was a film editor working under the famous Frank Capra on those Why We Fight shorts that one would frequently see before, the cartoons and the main features when you went to the movie theater. He also worked with some fella named, I believe his name was Theodore Geisel, in the animation and film department, a man who is better known worldwide as Dr. Seuss. While his career was dotted with feature film directorial work in films that could range from noir to pulpy trash to even angelically Christian themes, he mainly made his living as a TV director for over 40 TV series and TV movies, ranging from, the dawn of the TV era all the way to his final work in 1988 when he directed Bonanza: The Next Generation. Circling back, as always, to The Twilight Zone, this is actually the first of 4 episodes Claxton directed for Mr. Serling. They tapped him to direct 3 more times during season 3. Episodes such as The Jungle, The Little People, and I Sing the Body Electric, which was a Twilight Zone episode based on a Ray Bradbury story. Now, the episode was written by Richard Matheson. This one was not based on one of his short stories. This was not a Serling-penned adaptation. This is actually the first episode Richard Matheson ever wrote for the series, which is why it's a significant episode. And while the next 2 he wrote for the show this very season are of a somewhat lighter, even somewhat comedic tone at times, this was a work that displayed how Matheson also excelled at making his characters resonate with emotional empathy and how much pathos often permeated his best work. I do go into a bit more detail about Mr. Matheson on podcast episode number 434, when we had reached the first episode connected to Matheson and When the Sky Was Open. He's probably the writer I'm likely to cite the most on this podcast beyond Rod Serling himself, especially as I feel Richard Matheson probably has the most impressive and lengthy list of highly acclaimed written work to his credit. But for now, we can move away from Mr. Matheson and get on to the cast. In the lead role of Lieutenant William Terrence Decker, we have Kenneth Hay. Probably Hay's biggest claim to fame was his starring role on the stage in the play Look Back in Anger. It's been said that his role as Jimmy Porter, Hay created the angry young man British archetype that we would continue to see on stage and screen for decades to come. The working class anti-hero that seems to pop up on every other film and TV series from the UK for the past 70 years. To a certain extent, one might say Hay, unfortunately, peaked early in his career, and most of what came after never fulfilled the promise of that iconic stage performance, which, by the way, he didn't get the opportunity to recreate for the film adaptation. That role went instead to Richard Burton. He would get the occasional smaller role in features over the next few decades in films ranging from playing Brutus and Cleopatra to Sir Ranulph in Robin and Marion. He even had an uncredited role in the Beatles' Hard Day's Night. But overall, he mainly worked on TV all the way through the 90s, but tragedy, which seems to be a running theme when I do these, would strike him in 2003 when he almost choked to death on a chicken bone, and the resulting loss of oxygen led to brain damage, and he was consigned to a nursing home until his passing in 2018. Next, let's go to Simon Scott as Major Wilson, mainly a TV actor from the 50s through the early 1980s, although there were TV series he appeared in numerous times, such as Perry Mason and Ironside. I presume he was pals with Raymond Burr. The FBI and the Wild Wild West. I would say his biggest claims to fame were, number 1, a recurring role on the Mod Squad as Chief Barney Metcalf. He also had a recurring role as General Bronson on McHale's Navy. But his final role of his career was probably his biggest because he was the hospital administrator, Arnold Slocum, who often had to deal with the twin hassles of Gonzo and Trapper on just on 83 episodes of Trapper John M.D. Sadly, here we go again, he had to leave the role as the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease began to creep in, and he passed away 6 years later in 1991 at the age of 71. Let's move up the ranks to Major General George Harper, portrayed by Alexander Scorby. Brooklyn-born and raised, Scorby is probably best remembered for his voice, as it is his voice that millions heard through numerous audio versions of the King James Version of the Bible, as well as the entire Revised Standard Version of the Good Book of God. He also did considerable amounts of narration work, including 18 different National Geographic specials. Scorby achieved great acclaim as a stage actor, appearing in plays by the likes of Shakespeare, Ben Hecht, Jean-Paul Sartre. His film work was maybe not quite as impressive, but he still made an impression in films such as The Big Heat, Ransom, and Giant. But he himself wasn't particularly pleased with his film resume. But when he would look back on his career, the thing he was most proud of was the fact he had recorded an incredible 422 audiobooks for the blind. I do feel obligated, since there is one more role of some importance in this episode, to note that the role of Alexander Leadbottom McKay was portrayed by renowned stage and screen actor Robert Warwick, who was a star of silent films, but by the time Hollywood had discovered sound, at his age, he had transitioned more to character roles, and he appeared in several Preston Sturges films, including Sullivan's Travels. As he got older, he made nearly 200 film appearances, even starring with Humphrey Bogart in A Lonely Place. And TV paved the way for the few remaining years of his career before he fell ill and passed away in 1964. And now, on to the episode, The Last Flight, and we begin again with Mr. Serling's narration. Witness Flight Lieutenant William Terence Decker, Royal Flying Corps, returning from a patrol somewhere over France. The year is 1917. The problem is that the lieutenant is hopelessly lost. Lieutenant Decker will soon discover that a man can be lost not only in terms of maps and miles, but also in time. And time in this case can be measured in eternities. Now, as Decker lands his biplane, it is immediately evident that he is indeed lost in time, for we see the modern technology of military warfare from jets to jeeps, and his look of awestruck amazement, initially believing that the Americans just must be so much more advanced than anyone over the pond had ever heard. But as he's brought before Major General Harper, who is in charge of the base, it becomes crystal clear that he's actually traveled 42 years into the future. Not that anybody quite believes his story, particularly when he spins a yarn about how his last flight and how he had escaped while his flying comrade was surrounded by German fighters. For he says his flying partner was one Alexander McKay, who just so happens to be the man who's slated to visit the base later that day. A man who was renowned for his exploits in the next World War, saving hundreds of lives. This is something Decker cannot accept, because he insists McKay had died. We may later learn that on that last flight with McKay, Decker had took flight himself, cowardly leaving his partner to die as he flew into that mysterious white cloud that brought him 42 years later. In fact, his entire existence in the RAF was one of cowardice, ditching proper patrols and avoiding any sort of skirmish. But after it's suggested that perhaps someone did come to McKay's aid in that World War I dogfight, Decker realizes it can only be him who performs that heroic deed, that he must return. He must get back to save old Leadbottom, as he had affectionately nicknamed his buddy years ago. Decker eventually does escape. He gets to his plane, and after convincing Major Wilson to let him go, as Wilson did seem to be the only person who almost believed him the entire time, he takes off into that white cloud. Later, after Wilson has been reprimanded for allowing Decker to escape, Air Vice Marshal Alexander McKay does show up and instantly recognizes Decker's name when Wilson blurts it out. He then looks at Decker's belongings, and they begin to realize that maybe it really was true. And then we learn how Decker had burst out of the clouds, guns blazing, as he took on the German squadron that had surrounded McKay. It was enough to save McKay, even if it did cost Decker his life. But McKay doesn't know what's going on. How do they know Decker? Where did they get his personal effects? And that's when Wilson advises old Leadbottom to sit down, because they have a story for him. And that brings us to Serling's closing narration. Dialogue from a play, Hamlet to Horatio. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Dialogue from a play, written long before men took to the sky. There are more things in heaven and earth and in the sky than perhaps can be dreamt of. And somewhere in between heaven, sky, the earth, lies the Twilight Zone. So let me start with an opinion first before I get to anything else. I really, 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 really like this episode. It takes what could be an incredibly complicated, even convoluted premise and presents it with such clean clarity, with such effortless simplicity, even as it has layers of emotion as well as commentaries on courage and cowardice in the face of war. I love the fact that this is one that doesn't quite rely on a last-minute twist the way many Twilight Zone episodes tend to do, where I don't think the fact that Decker dies comes as a real surprise to the viewer. I think it's really about balancing the scales by having Decker forfeit his previously rather useless and unremarkable life, committing a great heroic deed that will then have ripples throughout time and save countless other people as a result. Rather, like I said before, it's an episode that introduces the premise almost instantly. I mean, the moment we see Decker's plane contrasting with all the others, we know this is a time travel story. And it must be war related. So almost by definition, it's going to be poignant and it's going to be powerful. And more than likely, it will have some element of unavoidable tragedy as well. And when you have all those things together, Jamie, it just makes for you kind of got the feeling this was going to be a really strong episode, even when you're just a few minutes into it. If you had watched it for the first time, and I'm sure folks who are doing a rewatch or maybe even yourself, this might be one of those episodes that you don't necessarily recall because it's not one of the more famous, iconic episodes, but it's one that where is this going? I'm really fascinated by this. And it really grabs you pretty quickly, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Just the lighting itself lends to grabbing your attention right at that first scene and giving us that classic highlight of the eyes and focusing all of our attention into the character immediately without really knowing who they are. Hay is fantastic in this, as he is in pretty much everything he's ever done. He has one of the I find his face to be one of the most amazing faces on television. There's something about the way he can tweak an expression just so gently. It's not just that he's a handsome man, because he is, but there is something so soft and strong just behind his eyes, and he always portrays this very quiet strength. So I do not remember watching this episode. It was a treat to watch it now and just take it all in. It was really, really beautiful.
I absolutely agree. I think Kenneth Hayes' portrayal of Lieutenant, or Lieutenant, as he says, Decker, is probably at the very least one of the better performances I've seen in these first 18 episodes of The Twilight Zone. And I don't know if it's just his realizations that he's a man out of time, or even more so when he confesses to, the litany of cowardly acts that he committed in the service. The great thing about this anthology series, The Twilight Zone, more so than perhaps any other, is you can get an immediate sense of character and the emotional resonance that character may be imbued with in such a short period of time. And when you have the combination of this fellow's acting skills and the writing of Richard Matheson kind of fusing together, I mean, it's a really strong episode. And it's one of those oh my God, it's already over. Because obviously it's already a short episode. It's only 22 minutes, but it felt like it was 5 minutes. It went so quickly. I was going through the various wiki pages devoted to both The Twilight Zone and this episode in particular, and I did come across this little gem on the general wiki page. So I didn't rewrite it. I'm just going to say it as is. That radio historian Martin Grams Jr. noted the similarities between this episode and a 1948 episode of the acclaimed radio drama series Quiet Please, called One for the Book. This is according to Graham's book, The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic. Serling himself was so concerned about the similarities that he attempted to buy the rights to Quiet Please just to avoid any potential copyright infringement. Now, I do enjoy the fact that Matheson himself noted how even the title has a double meaning, because it's not only about Deckard's last actual flight, but it's also flipping the meaning of flight, which, means to run away. This would be the last time Deckard would pick flight over fight, so to speak. Going into other information I came across for this one, according to Great Books Guy, who really does exceptional reviews of Twilight Zone episodes, Matheson also claimed he sold Serling and producer Buck Houghton on the idea for The Last Flight with a mere one-sentence synopsis. A British World War I pilot gets lost and lands on an American base in 1959, and that's all it took to sell him on it. So it's really kind of a lovely, poignant little episode. And speaking as someone who is such a fan of the writer involved, I think I might have mentioned on a previous podcast, he's technically or truly my favorite writer. So I'm always going to be a bit biased. This is one I don't remember quite as well because I probably haven't seen it as many times as some of his more iconic episodes. But watching it again just made me go, this is one of the best reasons to watch The Twilight Zone. It's not just about this simple, iconic, goofy twist at the end episodes. It's episodes like this, which just is why it was one of the best things on television then and now.
I would like to just jump in here really quick because I have kind of a treat for you. I was waiting to see if you mentioned it or not, but you didn't. So I wanted to share this with you. And you're going to instantly get this. So another show that you and I are both really big fans of was Quantum Leap. And the creator, Donald Belsario, has cited The Twilight Zone as a major influence. This episode has been specifically noted. And
really?
It makes a lot of sense. Just as I'm watching it, I was like, oh boy.
Yeah. Well done. Well done. I did not come across that. A lot of the factoids I came across tended to deal more with the actual military hardware and planes used throughout, and I didn't find that would make for very interesting podcast fodder. So I decided to skip all that. So I will move on to my roundup here. Now, the tone of this episode, it's definitely serious. Again, slightly suspenseful, mysterious, maybe even a little inspiring. Now, the tropes. Well, here we go. You got military. Oh, the military show up in Twilight Zone so often. Hey, flying too. Now, remember, if you go back to the very first Twilight Zone podcast, I said you're going to see a lot of that in the Twilight Zone, especially, of course, this is something that Richard Matheson wrote, but I was relating it to Serling's own background. But he just told you that Matheson sold him on it by talking about a pilot in the war, from two different war eras. Of course, Serling was going to pay off on it. Let's see. What else do we have for tropes? Well, of course, time travel, the classic man out of time. And you know what? I don't know if I've mentioned this before as a potential trope, but I'll use it here. Redemption. Because a lot of this is about redemption, because that is ultimately what the character achieves if it's not what he's ultimately seeking. Now, rating the ending. Now, it's a very solid ending. It's not one that's designed to put goosebumps on your arms, but more an emotional feeling, in your heart. And ultimately, some satisfaction, maybe a little bit of sadness as well. I will give the ending an 8. And I believe I'm going to stick with that for the episode overall. I almost was going to go 8.5, and I keep thinking about other episodes coming later. I was like, okay, no, I'll keep it with an 8. So an 8 for you. Okay, so now I think it's time to pay the check and depart this podcast. Jamie, I am simply thrilled that you could finally join me here. And I certainly look forward to seeing and hearing you once again on the pod.
Well, I really loved having a excuse to sit down with a big bowl of popcorn and a pen and some paper and turning on some beautiful black and white imagery and just getting lost in one of the best television series in television history. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and talk about it.
Always look forward to the opportunity to do it with a professional podcaster such as yourself. As for you, the listeners, on the next Twilight Zone podcast, which should be in about 2 weeks' time or so, I believe it will be Brian's turn at the co-piloting wheel, as we will preach about the Purple Testament, which would be the 19th episode of Twilight Zone Season 1, before we study the profundity of the 20th episode, Elegy. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And I also hope you will all join us then. Thank you, and good night.